Hi there, everyone, and welcome to the Daily Gardener, and thank you for listening. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling. It's July 22nd. Today, we remember the kind Harvard botanist who was also a friend of Darwin. We'll also learn about the botanist who specialized in South American flora and found the cinchona tree, the source of quinine. And we also salute the pioneer of the study of allelopathy. That's when one plant species releases chemical compounds that affect another plant species. And we also recognize the man who transformed the springtime landscape at the beautiful Magnolia Gardens. We also honor the first woman to attend Cornell University's School of Forestry. Today's unearthed words feature a poem called The Sleep of Seeds. And we grow that garden library with a book about the science, art, and joy of propagation. Learn how to grow whatever you want, whenever you want. And then we'll wrap things up with a delightful story about a horticulture teacher. But first, let's catch up on some greetings from gardeners from around the world and today's curated news. Well, today I thought I would share responses to a question that I asked in the Facebook group for the show. The question was, what is the biggest project that you have to tackle in your garden this year? Well, for me here at the cabin, it's adding beds around the trees and areas that my son doesn't like to trim. They're just difficult spots. One's by a culvert, and there are other areas where there are stands of trees, and they're just begging to be incorporated into a garden. Tim Zapata Elias says his goal is to keep the plants from being eaten by evil squirrels. I hear you there, Tim. And Debbie Gibson will be busy rearranging all 24 of her garden beds. Now that's a big garden. Mary Beth Hughes replied she wasn't sure where to start. They just moved on to an acre that hasn't been tended for many years, but she's brought over 200 plants from her previous home, and now she has different soil to contend with and deer to fend off. So she has a lot of work to do. And you know, when you think about moving, it's so stressful. And for most of us, it's almost unimaginable to think about leaving our gardens and some of our beloved plants behind. In fact, even here at the cabin, I've found that I bring a number of things back with me when I stop in Maple Grove to visit. Sometimes plants are like furniture. What works in one place just doesn't work in the new spot. Or maybe you just don't love it the way that you did in the old garden. And that's fine, although it can be hard to get over at first. But one thing I've learned, especially this spring, is that these new spaces really benefit from our wisdom, from all those years of trying, the successes and failures. And I think one of the things that I've gotten so much better at is spacing my plants. I do not just eyeball it anymore. I'm out there with a tape measure and orange cones, and I'm not so quick to dig. I let things sit a couple of days and look at it from a number of different angles. I'm much more thoughtful about where I plant. Anyway, Mary Beth, good luck with that project. I know it can be overwhelming when you're trying to install a garden and move into a new place at the same time. And Mary Klein said that she's working on replacing the timber steps in her woods. The cedar is rotting, so she's going to switch that out with treated wood, and hopefully it will last longer. And it is a very big job. And she said it can get very buggy, which of course, if it's in the woods, oh man, you've got to wear a lot of bug spray and be careful. And you know, her project brings me back to another challenge that so many of us have faced, which is shortages that we encountered during the pandemic. So I wish you very good luck in finding treated lumber at the big box stores near you. Shelley Davis wrote that she's building a greenhouse. And she also asked if I would share some pictures of how I put my pots up with the burlap. She said, The way you talk about it on your podcast makes me want to do it too. Well, I tell you, I hope these pictures weren't underwhelming for you, Shelley. But for those of you listening who haven't heard me talk about this before, all I do is get some burlap. I love to use old coffee bags. In the days before the pandemic, I would stop by a Dunn Brothers store because they always had free coffee bags available. And then I would cut them up into strips. And I really loved the texture of this burlap. And of course, the smelled like coffee beans. And then, of course, they had some printing on them, which was always a little artistic. Anyway, I cut the burlap into strips, and then I line the inside of my terracotta pots with the burlap. And also, I should mention, before I did that step, I would take some simple string, some jute string, and I would just run it through the hole in the bottom of the pot and then pull it up to the side of the pot and make a little bow. Now, if you do this, you have to make sure to leave plenty of slack because the last thing you want to do is tie that string tightly and then make it so that you can't put the burlap in and have it line the pot nicely, because the goal after doing all of this is to stack your pots without having to worry about them cracking during the winter. And it also makes them so much easier to pull apart. And if you've ever had a couple of terracotta pots that do not want to come apart, you know what I'm talking about. Now, one last tip I'll share with you about how I use these terracotta pots is that once I have them strung up with the cute little bow on the side and the burlap lining on the inside, then I just add to that with my soil and the plant. I just keep the string and the burlap in the pot. And it looks so adorable when you have that little perimeter of burlap sticking out over the pot. You can either curl it over the top or you can let it just kind of peek out all around the rim of the pot. It's very, very cute. Now, I can't completely claim to come up with this idea. I saw the string idea at one high-end greenhouse, and I saw the burlap idea at a little gift store. And so how I stack my pots is really a mashup of those two ideas. So there you go. Tomorrow we'll wrap up with some of the other projects that we learned about in the responses to this question. All right. Now, if you'd like to participate in the Gardener Greetings segment, all you have to do is get on the Facebook group for the show and start sharing your garden pics, your stories, your questions, your birthday wishes, and so forth. Or you can send them to me at Jennifer@thedailygardener.org. That's Jennifer@thedailygardener.org. Now, something you can do to make emailing me a little bit easier is just to add me as a contact in your phone. Put it under the Daily Gardener podcast and then add my email. Then when you're outside in your garden, it'll be very easy to email me pictures from your garden. And I love getting pictures from you guys. All right, it's time for today's curated news. Today's post was featured in Garden Design, and it was written by the knowledgeable plantsman and author Ken Drews. And the title of it caught my eye. It's 16 Drought-Tolerant Plants to Grow in Your Garden. And Ken points out something that I thought was so intuitive. He said, drought-tolerant plants can be identified just by looking at them or by feeling them or by smelling their bruised foliage. For instance, many fragrant herbs are drought tolerant. And after I read that, and now after you've heard it, it stands to reason. It makes complete sense. Now, here's Ken's list of the 16 plants, but I would encourage you to look up this post in the Facebook group for the show because he does a really wonderful job of describing each of them, and he gives you so much information about them. It's really worth a visit. So if you'd like to find this post in the Facebook group for the show, just search for the word drought, and this post will come up. But here's his list of 16 drought-tolerant plants: larkspur and nigella, morning glory, portulaca or rose moss, annual sunflowers, Acacia or yarrow, silphium or cup plant, helianthum with the common name rock rose, of course, rudbeckia, black-eyed Susan, and echinacea coneflower. And he also added ratibida, or the gray-headed coneflower. And then he wraps things up with asters, dianthus, euphorbias, foxgloves, sempervivum, so hens and chicks, sedum, tulips, mullins, bearded iris, and lilacs. So there you go. Ken Drew's top 16 drought-tolerant plants that you especially appreciate this time of year during the dog days. Now, today I wrote a post for the blog all about drying flowers. Have you ever tried drying flowers? If not, you should, because successfully drying one of your favorite flowers is such a joy. In fact, there are some flowers that actually even look better when they're dried. Now, there are many options for drying flowers. Air drying is the simplest. And then, of course, there is pressing, the old art of pressing flowers. And if you've never tried sand drying a bloom, you should give it a shot. All you need to do is fill a microwave-safe container with a layer of silica sand. You put the flower on top of the sand and then bury the bloom in it. Then you place that along with a cup of water in the microwave and you heat it in 30-second increments. Just keep checking it, and in about 2 to 3 minutes, your flower will be perfectly dried. Now, another step you can take in your flower drying hobby is to prepare a spot in your garden shed, garage, pantry, or kitchen and have it specifically be designated for drying flowers. This is a great hobby for you to repurpose a pot rack or to do something simple like string some twine between some eye hooks. And then you can use clothespins to hang your drying bouquets upside down. And sometimes that's all it takes to go from intention to action is creating the space. Just having that little clothesline of twine ready to go for drying flowers could be the inspiration you need to take some cuttings and bring some beautiful blooms indoors to dry. In fact, one of my all-time favorite pictures from my garden is of a single row of hydrangea cuttings, and they're all drying upside down, clipped to a string of twine in my kitchen. Such a beautiful image. Complete bliss. All right, that's it for today's gardening news. Now, if you'd like to check out my curated news articles and original blog posts for yourself, you're in luck because I share all of it with the listener community in the free Facebook group for the show, the Daily Gardener Community. So there's no need to take notes or search for links. The next time you're on Facebook, just search for Daily Gardener Community and request to join. I'd love to meet you in the group. Here's today's brevities. Today is the birthday of Cornelius Hermann Muller, who always went by Neil. He was an American botanist and ecologist, and he was born on this day in 1909. Neil pioneered the study of allelopathy, and that is a very difficult word to pronounce, so take it slow. Allelopathy. Allelopathy. Allelopathy occurs when one plant releases chemical compounds that affect another plant species. Think of the black walnut tree. It's a perfect example of allelopathy. In fact, in addition to the roots, the black walnut tree stores allelopathic chemicals in their buds, in the hulls of the walnuts, and their leaves. It is just brimming with chemicals. And that's why it's very challenging to garden beneath a black walnut tree. because it'll just kill the plants. And if you're a new gardener and you have a black walnut tree, make sure you do your homework so that you learn about the plants that can handle the chemicals given off by the black walnut. And today is the birthday of John Drayton Hasty of Magnolia Gardens. He was born on this day in 1917. The Drayton family has lived on the Magnolia Gardens plantation on the banks of the Ashley River since the 1670s. Magnolia Gardens is often regarded as one of the most staggeringly beautiful places in the entire South, and it's worth noting that it was built on the backs of slaves. The journalist Charles Kuralt once wrote about Magnolia Gardens. He said, by 1900, the Baedeker Guide to the United States listed 3 must-see attractions: the Grand Canyon, Niagara Falls, and Magnolia Gardens. And then he wrote, maybe because I'm a sucker for 300-year-old live oak trees hung with Spanish moss, and for azaleas and camellias and dogwoods, and for Cherokee roses growing on fences, I think I'd put Magnolia Gardens first on that list. Well, John Drayton Hasty, the man we remember today, represented the 9th generation of the Drayton family at Magnolia Gardens, and he was a passionate plantsman. He knew and loved all of the winding brick paths and the thousands of specimens at Magnolia Gardens, including the Middleton oak, which measured over 12 feet in diameter. And John Drayton Hasty knew all about the history of the gardens. In 1840, Magnolia Gardens was home to the first azaleas that were ever planted in America. And John often said that it was the successful cultivation of azaleas at Magnolia Gardens that led to the desire for the beautiful spring-blooming azalea all across the South, from Charleston to Mobile. And the oldest azalea at Magnolia Gardens is the Indicia from Holland. Now, John lived through some challenging times at Magnolia. After Hurricane Hugo ripped through the gardens, John was optimistic, and he said, there were some advantages, not that I wanted them. Before the hurricane, we had trouble getting sunlight, but now I'll be able to plant more roses and perennials. And Magnolia Gardens is where you'll find the Audubon Swamp Garden. It takes almost an hour to walk through it, and it's a feast for the senses. The Blackwater Swamp is swaddled by hundreds of black cypress and teeming with wildlife, from alligators and large turtles to herons and bald eagles. In addition to the swamp, Magnolia Gardens has a biblical garden, and it also has a huge maze, and it was inspired by the maze at England's Hampton Court to honor Henry VIII. Throughout most of the 20th century, John Drayton Hasty and his wife were the friendly and knowledgeable hosts to the over 150,000 guests and tourists that visited the property every year. Today, Magnolia Gardens is run by a nonprofit foundation that was established in 1985. John's grandson, Taylor, is writing a new chapter for Magnolia Gardens. Beginning in the early 2000s, Taylor worked to begin what experts call the most ambitious effort to unearth the records in the history of the plantation's slavery. The Magnolia Plantation Foundation funded the creation of a free online website and database dedicated to African American genealogy and history in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, and it's called Low Country Africana. And in my research of John Drayton Hastie, I discovered that before he died as an old man, he'd already experienced a brush with death. Almost 70 years earlier, in 1933, when John was 15 years old, he'd gone camping with some friends on Morris Island. And at some point, the boys went for a swim in the ocean. John was standing near the shore in about 2 feet of water when a shark attacked him. The shark bit John on both legs, and somehow he managed to free himself, and his buddies brought him to Fort Moultrie, where the medical staff was astounded by the severity of his wounds. John made a full recovery at Charleston Hospital. After John died in 2002, his remains were placed within an oak tree at Magnolia Garden. Today, there's a marker by the Drayton Oak, which reads, "Within this oak, planted 3 centuries ago in the original Magnolia Plantation Garden by his ancestor Thomas Drayton Jr. of Barbados, are interred the remains of John Drayton Hastie, whose later life was devoted to continuing the horticultural efforts of 8 generations of family predecessors and to transforming their springtime garden into one of beauty for all seasons." And it was on this day in 1938 that the St. Cloud Times ran a story about a Miss Louise Klein Miller. Louise, at the age of 84, was retiring as supervisor of Cleveland's Memorial Gardens after supervising them for over a quarter of a century. Louise was the first woman to attend Cornell University's School of Forestry, and she became the landscape architect for Cleveland schools. In fact, she was the only female landscape architect working in an extensive city school system during the early 1900s. Collinwood is a neighborhood on the east side of Cleveland, and on Ash Wednesday, March 4th, 1908, the Collinwood School fire became one of the country's biggest tragedies. The school had only 2 exits, and the construction of the school created a chimney effect. The school became a fire trap, and almost half of the children in the building died. And in 1910, it fell to Louise to plan the Memorial Gardens to honor the 172 children, 2 teachers, and 1 rescuer who died in the blaze. The year before, in 1909, the Ohio General Assembly passed legislation that said, quote, "A memorial should stand in perpetuity to honor those who lost their lives in this school fire tragedy." The Collinwood Memorial is a large square planting bed that's rimmed with 3.5-foot walls made of concrete that is tiled. The plantable area of the memorial measures roughly 20 feet by 40 feet. And there's also a deep bench around the perimeter, and the walls are slanted to make the seating more comfortable. The downside is that the bench and the scale of the raised bed make access to the planting area very challenging. During Louise's time, students grew flowers in a school greenhouse for the memorial. But over the next 70 years, the garden fell into neglect. 2018 was the 110th anniversary of the Collinwood School fire, and there have been a few attempts to make sure that the garden continues to be a meaningful memorial. But the struggle to maintain the memorial continues. But I did manage to stumble on an article from July of 1910. It was featured in the Santa Cruz newspaper, and it described the new memorial garden, which at the time included a large lily pond. And I thought you'd enjoy hearing this article. It's rather poignant. There was a poet who said he sometimes thought, that never blows so red the rose as where some buried Caesar bled, that every hyacinth the garden wears drops in her lap from some once lovely head, then there will never be lilies so fair as those that will bloom in the lily pond that is to be on the site of the Collinwood School. In Unearthed Words, I'm excited to share this poem from Lucia Kerchu. She gave me permission to share it with you on the show. It's from her book, Edible Flowers, and it's called The Sleep of Seeds. It didn't rain all summer. Instead of water, my father used prayer for his garden. Despite his friends' laughter, he planted spinach and lettuce, countless rows of cucumbers in beds lined up meticulously, ignoring old people's warnings about the drought. Every afternoon, he pushed his hat back, wiped off his sweat, and looked up at the empty sky, the sun scorching the acacia trees, shriveling in the heat. In July, the ground looked like cement. Like the ruins of a Roman thermal bath, it kept the vestiges of a lost order, traces of streams long gone. He yelled at me to step back from the impeccable architecture of climbing green beans, the trellis for tomatoes, although there was nothing to be seen. No seedlings, no tendrils, not even weeds. Just parched, bare ground, as if I were disturbing the hidden sleep of seeds. Isn't that great? One of my favorites for the month of July. It's time to grow that garden library with today's book, and the author will be familiar to you. It's Making More Plants by Ken Drews. This book came out in 2012, and the subtitle is The Science, Art, and Joy of Propagation, and it really is joyful when it works. Ken says that propagation, the practice of growing whatever you want, whenever you want, is gardening itself. Now, in this book, Ken shares his proven techniques to expand the plants in your garden. And this book is loaded with photos. There are over 500 images to help you practice the steps of propagating successfully. This book is 256 pages of propagation demystified, and it's all shared to help you learn the steps and tools necessary to create more plants. And what gardener doesn't want more plants? You can get a copy of Making More Plants by Ken Drews and support the show using the Amazon link in today's show notes for around $30. And finally, here's something sweet to revive the little botanic spark in your heart. While I was researching Louise Klein Muller, the woman who designed the memorial for the Collinwood School fire, I ran across a delightful story about her and her time teaching horticulture. Here's what it said. Louise had been telling a crowd of pupils about the different insects that attack plants, and she warned them especially against the malevolent San Jose scale. She suggested that the kids go to the school library and get a book about it and read about its habits and the remedy for stopping it. So the next morning, one young woman went to the librarian and she said she wanted something about the San Jose scale. Well, without even looking up from her desk, the librarian said, "Go to the music department." Thanks for listening to The Daily Gardener, and remember, for a happy, healthy life, garden every day. The Daily Gardener is produced in lovely Wyoming, Minnesota with the help of Paige Mance, Brooke Bierbaum, Kiana Rayleigh, Maddie Doyle, Natalie Decker, and Eric Begay. You can find The Daily Gardener on all your favorite social media. You can follow the show on Instagram, and listeners always have a standing invitation to join the free Facebook group for the show. Just search for Daily Gardener Community the next time you're on Facebook and request to join. All the stories and books that are featured on the show can be found over at thedailygardener.org, thedailygardener.org. And while you're there, be sure to sign up for my free Friday newsletter. Last but not least, you can share your own gardener greetings on the show by emailing me at jennifer@thedailygardener.org. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling, and as always, have a great day in the garden, and we'll see you tomorrow.